Today, we are going to be speaking with Robert Reich, who served as Secretary of Labor in the Bill Clinton administration. He's professor of the graduate school at University of California, Berkeley, and co-founder of Inequality Media, also writing a very interesting Substack these days. It's so great to have you on. I really appreciate this.
Well, thank you for asking me, David.
So at a very top level, I like what I'm seeing from President Joe Biden when it comes to labor. I know that it made very significant headlines when he became the first president to join striking workers on a picket line. But when it comes to the NLRB, when it comes to indirectly Amtrak and other union represented entities, it seems to me that what we observed with Biden through decades of public service is being reflected in his presidency in terms of his support of labor. Am I
Nope.
overstating the case? Do you see the same
No,
thing?
in fact, if anything, David, you're understating it. He is the most pro-labor president in recent American history. I mean, if you look at, for example, Carter or Clinton, and I was Clinton's labor secretary, or Obama, you don't get a president that comes close to Biden in terms of his support for labor unions. And it's not just the symbolic support, like being on the lines and walking on the picket lines, but it is also a National Labor Relations Board that is the most pro-union National Labor Relations Board. And he goes out of his way again and again to do what the unions and particularly organized labor and workers need. I mean, this is a worker-centered economic policy, and it's extraordinary.
You wrote this Newsweek op-ed, which is very interesting, and you used the term adult in the room about Joe Biden. And to me, that's interesting because there's a lot there about governance and leadership style, particularly in comparison to other political figures. Right now, on the American right, we see, everything from Joe Biden is so cognitively gone, he doesn't know what day it is, but also to less outrageous criticisms about his unwillingness or indifference to work with, quote, the other side. And the value of working with the other side, to me, depends on who's on that other side. And I'm glad for you to address that if you want. When it comes to style in 2023, given both the corporate governance environment that we have, and if you want to go beyond that into foreign policy or elsewhere, do you think that Biden's style is well suited to what is currently taking place?
David, I do, and I'll tell you why. When I talk about Biden as being the adult in the room, I mean, relative to almost every other political actor and business actor. I mean, look at Elon Musk, for example. I mean, you have in Biden somebody who is mature, who is reasonable, who is steady, somebody who is not easily rattled and is saying what is very, very sensible. Now, he gets drowned out by people like Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump is getting angrier and kind of more and more unhinged day by day. And a lot of voters and potential voters are very attracted to Trump's just his craziness. I mean, just the notion that you have somebody who's willing to say crazy things and be so anti-establishment, even though Trump, and I know he is the most pro-establishment president we've had. But Biden is steady. I am very confident. Now, I hope I don't eat my words, but I'm very confident that that kind of steadiness, that kind of adult in the room quality is going to get him reelected.
I want to address a criticism that I see made of you and made of me and made of some others. And the gist of it is you guys all sound super progressive and, healthcare, labor unions, it's all fine. But why is it that you are so big on Joe Biden when there are, at least on paper, more progressive alternatives for president? Cornel West is running. Jill Stein has decided to enter the fray. For me, it's a very practical question of, will my vote further help, or will it restrain the possibility of someone like Trump getting another 4 years? It's very practical as a question for me. I'm curious, as someone with progressive credentials like yourself, why not support someone that is at least ostensibly to the left of Joe Biden for president?
because in our winner-take-all system, and it is a winner-take-all system between two major parties, if you support somebody else, that somebody else, particularly somebody else who's going to draw votes potentially away from Biden, you are supporting, in effect, Donald Trump. And that is the reality we find ourselves in. I mean, in 2016, I was a big supporter in the primaries of Bernie Sanders,
As
and
was
I
I.
still, I think Bernie would have made a great president. I am
Yep.
still very, very much in his corner. But when it came to actually what you do between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, there was no question in my mind. I mean, Donald Trump would have been and was, and I said at the time in 2016 and debated a lot of progressives about this, a total calamity for the nation. And if he gets a second term, he's going to be a worse calamity because now he's going to surround himself with people who will have no constraints, no restraints, will actually let him do exactly what he wants to do. And he will not even be constrained by the possibility of another election. So I just don't think, as a practical matter, there's no issue here. You have to vote for Joe Biden.
I would be curious if you have any ideas of how to best communicate this at a broader level. People will call in over the last week. I've had people call in and say, David, I was going to vote Biden, but what he's doing on Israel and Gaza, I just can't get behind. And I'll ask some specific questions. What do you mean? What exactly is he doing? Sometimes people don't even really know. Sometimes they do. Doesn't matter. I will then say, if your concern is that Biden is not doing enough for Gazans, why would you take an action that risks putting into power a guy who would do literally zero for that group, which would be Donald Trump? And I feel like I have the right motivation, but I'm maybe not making the argument in the most effective way. Is there a better way to reach folks who have that instinct?
Well, I think the people who do have that, as you put it, that instinct, what they say, and they say to me, they probably say to you, is, I'm tired. Excuse me, I'm simply tired of voting for the lesser of two evils.
Yes,
I want to vote for who I want to vote for. That's what democracy is all about.
right.
And I understand that point. I'm sympathetic to that point. But it is totally unrealistic given that we are facing two parties, one of which is headed by and is about to nominate a fascist. And this is not just a matter of degree. This really is a contest between democracy and neo-fascism. And anybody who is not going to vote for Joe Biden because, well, I don't want to vote for I'm tired of voting for the lesser of two evils, is really, in effect, voting for the evil of all evils.
I want to talk a little more practically, maybe going back to your time as Secretary of Labor and just in general about the way that change happens in the United States or in countries that are organized like the United States. I could imagine that if we thought, what are the biggest ideas that maybe as a left-leaning progressive Secretary of Labor one might want to put in place? Well, what about the separation of healthcare and employment? So many of us would like to see healthcare and employment separated, not only for the obvious reason that it's arbitrary to connect them, but also because people will be freer to work in areas where they will actually be most passionate and effective rather than having to keep a job only to be able to keep healthcare, et cetera. But that's arguably not something that can be done in a 4-year term. It's not something that can be done just because a Secretary of Labor wants that to happen. What was your approach, if you agree with my perspective on this, that's maybe bigger than is possible in 4 years? What was your approach for figuring out what do I want to work on? Where can I actually make change in the time that I have, and segmenting the different goals that you might have?
Well, it's a very, very good question. When I was Secretary of Labor, I asked myself this question all the time. There are two schools of thought. And when I went into the job, I thought incrementally, well, what is at the edge of the possible? What can I work on that makes the edge of the possible actually possible? The
Right.
kind of Overton window, as it's kind of conventionally talked about. But as I got deeper and deeper into the office, I realized that there are a lot of things out there that look impossible, but actually the public is very, very strongly behind them. Let me give you an example, David. When the Republicans took over both houses of Congress in 1996, At that time, I thought, well, wait a minute, the minimum wage has not been raised for years, and I think the public is behind it. It turned out that 86% of the public on most polls were behind increasing the minimum wage. I went to the Republican leadership and Democratic leadership, gave them the polls, and said, if you don't respond to this, we are going to make a major issue out of your lack of response.
Hmm.
And lo and behold, we raised the minimum wage in a Republican Congress, Republican Senate, Republican House. It's that kind of thing. You're talking about right now with healthcare, Medicare for all, for example. It is
Sure.
very popular. People want it. Bernie Sanders made it very popular, but it was popular even before Bernie. I think that if some leaders would say to Congress, "Here, we're introducing Medicare for all. What are you going to do about it?" I think that would be a very important thing to do, and it might actually pass.
Do you think that in general, well, I guess let me put it a different way. There was a period of time during the Obama administration after the Sandy Hook shooting where similarly there was 88% support for what we would call a universal background check for all firearms purchases, the highest point, I believe, in history where there was support for that among voters. And yet, only a much smaller portion of the elected officials at the time supported that policy. And it did not become the law, even though you would have thought that circumstances would have been the ideal circumstances to make that law. So there's some kind of a disconnect here where, at least to some degree, well, let me ask you, what is the disconnect? Is it as simple as our elected officials don't represent the will of the voters? Is it systemic?
It is both. It's systemic, and our elected officials often don't represent the will of the voters because of money, because of big money. And whether that big money is coming from, the makers of automatic weapons, automated guns, or the big money is coming from big corporations in Wall Street, it is there. It is part of our system. But that doesn't mean that it has to be. I mean, I look at the advent of Donald Trump as ironically a kind of a distorted populism. Remember, it wasn't that long ago that we had Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders in the same year challenging both of their parties. I think if Bernie Sanders had been the nominee in 2016, he might have actually won because there is so much of an anti-establishment populist streak in America right now. And I think that part of that comes from the public's anger at all of the money in politics. Again, ironically, I mean, Donald Trump is, he puts on a good show
Yes.
of being kind of a populist in terms of, I am your mouthpiece, I am your vehicle. But can you imagine a Democrat, a real populist, a real lefty, making that same sort of pitch as Bernie Sanders did in 2016? I think would be enormously effective.
So let me
And let
ask
me
a
just
question about that. I'm curious. I have a concern about the populist rhetoric, which I don't see populism as a series of policies. I see it as a rhetoric which can be used to justify good policies or really bad policies. My concern about the populist rhetoric being successful since Trump and Bernie, et cetera, is that people can be lulled in by the rhetoric. But then if the wrong person, if the wrong type of populist gets in power, the solutions are a disaster. So, in the same way that Bernie's populism would lead him to policies on immigration and labor that I would agree with, Tucker Carlson's populism leads him to say the problem is, and I quote, brown people who are making the country dirtier. That is a concern to me about the rise of the populist rhetoric that I wonder if you share.
well, I see. I don't think that it's rhetoric
Hmm.
that is the essence of populism. I think it's who you choose as your enemy. In other words, who you are saying to the public is the
Hmm.
reason why wages are flat and have been suppressed for years. Why the country is not responding to the popular will. and various other things. And what a true left-wing populist would say is it's because of big corporations, Wall Street, and billionaires who are corrupting the system. It's the oligarchy. And our real choice here is either democracy or oligarchy disguised as kind of neo-fascism, which is what we are getting through Donald Trump. So populism itself is not rhetorical. It's the popular and appropriate form of populism, it seems to me, ought to be. And if I were advising Joe Biden, I'd say it's not just the picket line. Joe, Mr. President, go further than this. Criticize what Wall Street is doing to this country, what the private equity people are doing, what the hedge fund people are doing. Look at the corporations, the C-suites, the ratio of CEO pay to the average worker's pay. Look at what's happening to inequality in this country in terms of average workers still not getting very much of an increase. They are getting more of an increase than they did before, but relative to the top 1/10 of 1%,
Right.
very, very little. Look at the money that is overwhelming our politics, coming from the billionaires and from corporations and from Wall Street. You see, that is, it seems to me, what people want to hear. That is true. It is not. It is not Trumpian. It is a populist, and it's not just rhetoric. It is. It is. It is truth. It's about power in this country.
Last thing I want to ask you about, as a general sense, do you have any prediction for 2024 in terms of questions, obviously about the eventual general election, but will Trump going from criminal courthouse to courthouse have any impact on the Republican electorate's willingness to make him the nominee? Will it impact general election voters more than Republican primary voters? Or does this entire thing not even really matter to those who will vote for him now?
Well, I look at there are 30% of Americans, or 35%, who are in Trump's pocket, and it doesn't matter what Trump does, what he
Yes,
says, what happens to him. If anything, all of the litigation, the lawsuits, the criminal, they are making him into a martyr for them. But I think that when it comes to the general election, so he is going to get the nomination. I would be
agreed.
surprised if he didn't.
Yep.
But when it comes to the general election, I think Americans are better than that. I don't. I look at that Times Siena poll that freaked everybody out 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
It's too early to get freaked out, and those polls mean nothing. I think Joe Biden is going to be reelected, and America's kind of come to its senses.
Yeah, I happen to agree with you. I think that the very fact that this has energized his base is almost evidence that certainly among Democrats, most of which would not vote for Trump anyway, but certainly also among independents, about half of whom did vote Trump in 2020, I think it will ultimately hurt Donald Trump in the long run. And I have the same expectation as you do. The question then becomes, do you expect the exact same 2-year circus about a stolen election to ensue after November of 24, the way we saw a few years ago?
Oh, absolutely. I don't
You
think there's
do.
any question about it. I mean, Donald Trump is going to, he has latched on to this notion of a stolen election. A lot of his followers have latched onto it, and now you have social media. Facebook is allowing back on messages about the election being stolen. So yes, you are going to get this feedback loop of crazy Trumpists who are going to continue to have the same theme right beyond 2024.
Well, something I guess to look forward to, maybe more to be prepared for than to look forward to is the better way to say it. We've been speaking with former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich. We will link to his Substack. Really appreciate your time and insights today.
Well, thank you, David.